In late June 1981, a shocking act of violence shook the political atmosphere of Tehran. A well-known Iranian cleric and influential political figure, who had gained prominence after the events of 1979, was attending a gathering at a mosque in the capital city. During the session, a man pretending to be a journalist placed a recording device close to him. Within moments, the device exploded, leaving him severely wounded and permanently affected for the rest of his life. Yet despite surviving a near-fatal attack, he did not disappear from public life. Instead, he continued his political ascent and eventually became the highest authority in the Islamic Republic of Iran. But who orchestrated this assassination attempt? And how did this violent episode shape the mindset and leadership style of the man who would guide Iran for decades? If you appreciate deep historical investigations and powerful political stories like this, consider subscribing and joining our community as we uncover the events that shaped modern nations. This is the story of Ali Khamenei, the second supreme leader of Iran. Born in 1939 in the northeastern city of Mashhad, within the historic province of Khorasan, his early life began during a very different era of Iranian history. At that time, the nation was officially known as the Imperial State of Iran, long before it became the Islamic Republic. Historical sources differ slightly regarding his exact birth date, with some accounts suggesting an alternative date within the same year. His father, Javad Khamenei, was a respected Shia scholar originally, from a village in the East Azerbaijan region of northwestern Iran. The family name itself traces back to that village. Of Iranian Azeri descent, they belonged to one of the largest ethnic minority communities within the country. After studying religious scholarship in Najaf, Iraq, one of the most significant centers of Shia learning, and his father eventually settled in Mashhad. There he married and raised a large family, shaping the religious and cultural environment in which his son would grow up. Before we continue deeper into the political transformation of Iran and the forces that shaped his rise to power, make sure to like this video and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue producing in-depth historical documentaries. Stay with us until the end, because this story reveals far more than a single explosion. It uncovers the making of one of the most influential figures in modern Middle Eastern history, have risen to positions of prominence within Iranian society, though this has occasionally seen them clash with Ali in his role as supreme leader of the country since 1989, for instance. His younger brother Hadi is a cleric who was a member of the Iranian parliament. The majors between 2000 and 2004. Hadi was also a member of the reform-minded Association of Combatant Clerics. This organization was then arguing for a reduction in the power of the supreme leader, in addition to a reduction in the influence of the mullahs and mosque leaders who surround him. Ali's education began at a young age in Mashhad. This was substantially at the direction of his father, who emerged as a mujtahid, a scholar who was deemed to be of sufficient religious knowledge and learning so as to be able to interpret religious law himself. At the same time, Javad Khamenei was sometimes absent from Mashhad and returned to Najaf in Iraq on occasion. The family lived a modest life in Mashhad. They were not wealthy or possessed of many material trappings, yet they were held in high regard within the community on account of Javad's status as a respected religious cleric. He often led Friday prayers and was consulted by local leaders. Similarly, Ali's mother was well educated and taught him about Persian history, art, and literature. Khamenei has since emphasized the austere lifestyle of his childhood, claiming that the family lived in a one-room house with little else beyond a basement and subsisted primarily on bread, dates, and raisins. This is quite possibly an exaggeration of how modest their lives were. Khamenei's life was shaped by political developments in his homeland from even before he was born. Iran, or Persia as it was known throughout history until modern times, was one of less than a dozen nations in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia that was not colonized in the 19th century, Iran thus sits alongside Abyssinia or Ethiopia and Liberia in Africa, as well as countries such as Japan, China and Siam in Asia. Persia had a long and proud history, with empires having emerged from this part of Central Asia since antiquity. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, it was the power in the region which stopped the further eastward expansion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This occurred under the Safavid dynasty. At the end of the 18th century, the Qajar dynasty came to power. The Qajar rulers adhered to Twelver Shia Islam, a branch of Shia Islam which holds that there were 12 legitimate imams or leaders of the Islamic faith after the Prophet Muhammad, beginning with his son-in-law Ali, and ending with Muhammad al-Mahdi, the latter of whom will, like the second coming of Christ in Christian belief, re-emerge one day to redeem the Islamic faith. The Qajar dynasty's adherence to Twelver Shia forms an important link with the Iranian Revolution, which would start Khamenei's ascent to become the supreme leader of Iran in modern times. The Qajar rulers technically reigned down to 1925. However, already in 1921, the Middle East had been reshaped after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. In that year, a military coup had occurred in Iran, which was led by a military officer by the name of Reza Shah Pahlavi. He claimed full power in 1925 and established the Pahlavi dynasty, a much more secular-orientated royal house. He was himself overthrown in 1941 during the Second World War after the British and Soviets invaded Iran out of fear that it was about to ally with Nazi Germany. His 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne, though Iran remained under close Allied oversight for the duration of the war. Post-1945 he began to rule in his own right. His lengthy reign of nearly 4 decades was a strange mix of authoritarianism and liberalism, in which Iran was one of the few countries in the Middle East with a relaxed religious environment. However, the Shah's secret police, the Savak, oversaw a system of mass surveillance, repression and torture of perceived opponents of the regime. The Shah's regime was anxious to keep a handle on religious movements that it believed might challenge the secular rule of the Shah. Despite this, Iran was home to many religious schools that adhered to rigid and conservative values, and Iran remained a profoundly religious society, even under the Shah's rule. Khamenei's early life reflected this. In the mid-1950s, he began studying under leading religious scholars like Ayatollah Sheikh Hashem Qazvini in Mashhad. The city was a renowned religious site, owing to it being the resting place of the 8th Imam of Twelver Shia, Ali ibn Musa. Mashhad was also home to many Shia scholars and ayatollahs other than Ali's father. Ayatollah is a name for a high-ranking religious leader or scholar within Twelver Shia Islam. From Mashhad, Khamenei crossed the border briefly to study in the city of Najaf in Iraq, the burial place of Ali, the first Imam of Shia Islam. As the resting place of Ali, Najaf is consequently amongst the holiest places in the world for Shia Muslims. After a brief period there, Khamenei returned to Iran and settled in the city of Qom. It was here that he began studying under Ayatollah Khomeini in 1957, the individual who, over 2 decades later, would become the first supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. By 1957, Khomeini was already developing a reputation as a prominent opponent of the Shah's regime. Khamenei's life was shaped in many ways by the events of 1963. Early that year, the Shah launched a policy program designed to modernize Iran along Western lines and expand its economy. A core element of what is termed the White Revolution included an attempt to reform the system of landholding in Iran. This threatened to undermine the traditional structures of Persian society and aroused opposition from within the clerical class. In the midst of it, Ayatollah Khomeini became even more vocal in his opposition to the Shah's regime than he had been already. He was placed under arrest an action which led to protests around the country in June 1963, during which hundreds of people lost their lives. The Ayatollah continued to denounce both the Shah and the influence of his Western allies in Iran, particularly that of the United States. As a result, the Shah determined that the best way to deal with the threat of Khomeini was to simply remove him from Iran. In 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile. He spent over 14 years outside of Iran, first briefly in Turkey, then primarily in Iraq. Towards the end of the 1970s, he spent a few months in France. In Iraq, he became a focus for foreign opposition to the Shah and, as a result, fellow dissidents joined him in exile there. Khamenei was not among them. Although he was a keen supporter of his former teacher and his political views, Ali remained in Iran. He also left Qom and returned to his native Mashhad to help care for his aging father, who had become blind in one eye. This is significant for later events, as it meant that Khamenei never completed the full religious training at Qom or Tehran. This religious training, for some, was later perceived as vital to qualify for the position of the supreme leader of the country. Khamenei did begin to play a major role in the clerical opposition to the Shah's rule within Iran in the period between the White Revolution in 1963 and the Iranian Revolution of the late 1970s. In 1967, he helped translate The Future in Islamic Lands by the Egyptian religious scholar Sayyid Qutb from the Arabic into Farsi. Qutb was a major influence on the subsequent development of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda. His book called for religious revolution to overthrow secular forces across the Middle East, like the government of the Shah. Khamenei also wrote a foreword to the translation, which bluntly stated that, quote, "The future belongs to Islam." Publication of the book was broadly prevented by Savak, the Shah's secret police. It was the beginning of a period in which Khamenei was arrested on several occasions and held for months at a time. In between these periods of detention, he traveled around the country and gave sermons and speeches in which he railed against the Shah. His most prolonged period of arrest was in 1975, when he was detained in Tehran between January and August of that year. During this time, he was largely kept in solitary confinement, and his family was not informed as to his location. Undeterred, in 1977, he helped found the Association of Combatant Clergy, which, as the name suggests, was a religious group set up to oppose the regime. Khamenei's family life was modest during these years. In 1964, after returning to Mashhad from Qom, he married his sole wife, Mansoura Khojaste Bagherzadeh. Despite his subsequent standing within Iranian society, very little is known about her. There are, for instance, no photographs of her, and few even know what she looks like. In an interview which she once gave, she described how she and her husband had discussed the possibility of his arrest by the Shah's government from the earliest days of their marriage. Mansoura stated that she agreed with her husband's mission. She viewed her own role as being to provide stability in the household during his frequent bouts of imprisonment. They had 6 children, 4 sons, named Mostafa, Mojtaba, Masood, and Maysam, and 2 daughters, Hoda and Boshra. The family continued to live a relatively frugal life even after the Iranian Revolution and Khamenei's rise to power. Khamenei is also said to have been a more open-minded religious cleric in some respects than his contemporaries, such as the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ali, for instance, was known to read Western books like the works of the American author John Steinbeck. This doesn't necessarily suggest he was approving of Western culture, but it does demonstrate a greater desire to understand the mind of the average American and Westerner in a way which the Ayatollah did not countenance. Several of the Western books which Khamenei read simply intensified the cleric's critical views of Western culture. By the time that Khamenei contributed to the founding of the Association of Combatant Clergy in 1977, the political environment in Iran was deteriorating. In spite of efforts by the Shah and his secret police to clamp down on opposition, anti-Pahlavi sentiment was growing, and there were an increasing number of public demonstrations of unrest. Opposition swelled in 1978, driven by riots and police crackdowns that led to hundreds of deaths. A galvanizing incident was the Cinema Rex fire of the 19th of August 1978, when over 400 people were killed after the cinema in question in the city of Abadan was barricaded, shut and set on fire. Islamic terrorists were probably responsible, but the Shah's government was blamed at the time. A sign of how weak the regime had become was seen when it pressured the government of Saddam Hussein to force Ayatollah Khomeini out of Iraq. It was clear that Khomeini's presence in Iran's neighboring country was feared by the Shah's regime. Khomeini left for France, even as the protests intensified in Iran in the final months of 1978. The Iranian Revolution came to a peak in January 1979, when hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Tehran and other cities. Meanwhile, the Shah, whose health was in severe decline, fled from Iran on the 16th of January 1979. By then, the Islamic Revolutionary Council had been formed as a 13-man body, charged with overseeing the transition to Islamic rule. As the Shah's government collapsed, its actions were clandestine. However, it was revealed in 1980 that Khamenei was a member. This was a revelation which surprised many and which signified his ascent as one of the leaders of the revolution. Just over 2 weeks after the Shah's flight, the Ayatollah landed at Mashhad International Airport in Tehran from France on the 1st of February. Over the next 10 days, what remained of the secular government that had controlled Iran since the 1920s collapsed. The 11th of February is typically celebrated today as the conclusion of the Iranian Revolution, 10 days after the Ayatollah's return to the country. The Iranian Revolution had succeeded in overthrowing the government of the Shah, yet the issue of what kind of alternative government would take its place was not as simple an issue as is often assumed. The opposition to the Pahlavi dynasty had not been a unified Islamist movement, led by Ayatollah Khomeini from exile and by clerics like Ali Khamenei from within. Instead, opposition to the Shah had consisted of a broad coalition of Shia clerics, other Islamic groups, more secular-minded politicians, and even left-wing entities tied to the Soviet Union within the context of the Cold War. Throughout 1979, there was a tug of war between these varying groups to see what kind of political system would be put in place. There were many who wished for a continuation of the kind of secular society that the Shah had overseen, just with the Shah removed and a Western-style democracy created. However, the pro-democracy and moderate Islamist factions lost out in the course of 1979 as the Ayatollah and the clerics cemented their control over the country. In December 1979, Khomeini was established as the first supreme leader of the newly created Islamic Republic of Iran. There were democratic elements to the new state, but effectively it became a theocracy. The Ayatollah's image now adorned public places all over Tehran and other major cities. In the course of the 1980s, Khamenei played a role in this process. He was involved in the establishment of the Islamic Republican Party, the official government party that would dominate the country's politics down to 1987. He was also given a senior role in purging the Iranian army and security forces of officers that were residually loyal to the Shah's regime. Khamenei nearly lost his life early on in the history of the new Islamic Republic in an incident which left him with life-altering injuries. On the 27th of June 1981, he arrived at the Abuzar Mosque in Tehran to speak with members of the mosque's congregation. Khamenei's position as a member of the new parliament and as the leader of Friday prayers in the capital meant that he was fast emerging as a prominent member of the Islamic regime. This made him a target for dissidents. The government was far from secure by the early 1980s. It faced a range of counter-revolutionary forces in the shape of continued supporters of the Pahlavi dynasty, Marxist groups supported by the Soviet Union like the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran and also the Furqan Group. The latter were a militant religious group that combined a social view of Iranian society, opposing wealthy Iranian business figures tied to the new regime. The Furqan Group also looked to dismantle the clerical system that placed great power in the hands of figures like Supreme Leader Khomeini and Ali Khamenei. That day in the Abuzar Mosque in Tehran, a member of the Furqan Group, disguised as a journalist, placed a tape recorder in front of Khamenei to apparently record what he said as he answered questions. About a minute later, the device started to make a whistling sound. It then exploded. A message was later found inside the remains of the device, saying, "A gift from the Furqan Group." The explosion left him critically wounded, and he was rushed to a medical facility for emergency treatment. Though his life was saved, the damage was severe. The nerves in his right arm were permanently affected, leaving it largely immobile. Injuries to his neck also caused lasting harm to his vocal cords. As a result, in public appearances, whether addressing Friday congregations or speaking to the nation, his voice has often carried a softer, restrained tone, a reminder of the attack he endured decades ago. Yet the attempt on his life did not end his political ambitions. Instead, it marked the beginning of a rapid rise. Within a short period, he would ascend to one of the highest offices in the country. Just days before the bombing, Iran's first post-revolution president, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, had been removed from office amid political tensions and accusations that his policies were drifting too far from the revolutionary vision. Soon after, the newly appointed president, Mohammad Ali Rajai, was killed in another devastating bombing only weeks into his tenure, an attack widely attributed to opposition militants. These dramatic and violent turns of events reshaped Iran's leadership structure in a matter of weeks, creating a power vacuum at a critical moment in the nation's history. In the next part, we will explore how these assassinations and political upheavals opened the path for a new era of leadership and how the balance of power in Iran shifted permanently. If you want to understand how these events transformed the future of Iran, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. The next chapter reveals how survival, political calculation, and timing combined to shape one of the most powerful positions in the modern Middle East.